Okay, greetings in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. I hope this finds you doing well and standing fast in God's truth, strong in the Lord and in the strength of His might. Now, I say greetings, but maybe I should say instead, howdy, y'all, because it's good to be a Texan. Big news today for Texas. I'm recording this on Tuesday, March 2nd, 2021. But as you know, our governor announced that there's no more statewide mask mandate and all businesses will be allowed to open at 100% capacity. Here he was today in a Lubbock restaurant making that announcement in a news conference that he had there. And so Texas is now the largest state to have removed mask mandates and restrictions for businesses. Of course, we realize that the coronavirus is still a problem, though, and likely most of us will continue to wear our masks in most public places, at least in our worship services. I'm sure for the time being we're still going to require them, and local governments, cities and counties can still have their own mask mandates. I'm not sure if Houston is still under a mask mandate. I believe so, but it will be up to individual businesses as to whether they're going to require a mask. And so I'm sure for the time being we're still going to have some mask wearage going on. But isn't it nice to live in Texas where at least the statewide mandate is gone? And in case you're watching this from the future, yes, way off in the future, and if the United States of America is long gone, if you're watching this from another planet or another continent in another millennium, maybe thousands of years from now, well, there was once this great state of Texas, and here's a more accurate map to tell you a little bit about Texas. And this is where we are right here on this map. We're right here in the Houston area, so League City, Texas, and the League City Church of Christ. So, all right. If the audio sounds a little bit different, it's because I changed rooms. I apologize if that's a little bit of a distraction, but just wanted you to know why. Hopefully the audio in here isn't too bad. So as we continue to look at the symbolism in John's Gospel, I know I've been spending a lot of time here. I need to finish it today and move on. And actually, I wasn't happy at all with the last class. As I've told the class several times, this is the first time that I've taught this material. If I could go back and start and do it all again, there is a lot I would leave out, and there's a lot of stuff I would condense. And all that stuff I talked about in the last class, I really wish I would have just devoted maybe 5 or 10 minutes to, instead of an entire class. So I apologize that you're having to endure sometimes just too much material and maybe some things that don't seem as relevant or helpful or as practical, but I hope still there's a value in having this material, and I appreciate your patience. And we really do need to continue to look at the symbolism of the fourth gospel, because it is such an integral part in the way that Christ is presented to us and the truth about Christ, and it makes it so powerful, as we've pointed out. So what we're going to look at now under this category, we're still looking at literary features, and we want to finish with the literary features hopefully today, and then move on to John's use of the Old Testament. And we won't spend a lot of time on that, but we do need to note it. And then we'll look at, finally, the themes and theology of his gospel, and then the Christology of John's gospel, and then we can finish and just have kind of a review of the whole course that we've had here. But under symbolism, we need to take note of the pervasive use of irony in the fourth gospel. In fact, irony is so much a part of the Gospel of John that one writer has even said that the theology is irony in the fourth gospel. And I stopped the recording to check. I noticed that I have here this little footnote, and I accidentally deleted the reference to that, but I believe it was McCrae, and it's in Kirstenberger's book on the theology of John, Theology of John's Gospel and Letters. But still, it's an interesting way to think of the Gospel of John, that the theology is presented to us in the irony that we see. And so let's think about this for a minute. So we have in John's Gospel both situational, extensive use. Of course, you find this to some extent in the synoptics, but you have, it's a whole nother level in John's Gospel. So you have this extensive use of both situational and verbal irony. And the verbal irony is often involves double entendre, and that makes it often interesting and very humorous even, because we will find in John's Gospel that people often say more or even the opposite of what they intend. And there's one great example of this that is my favorite in the whole book as far as that phenomenon, and we'll note it, or as they say in Western New York, phenomenon. But we'll take note of that in just a moment. Now, just for a moment, let's give a couple of humorous examples here. Now, when we hear the expression double entendre, unfortunately, in our culture, people typically think of something that is off color, that there's some sexual connotation there in the double meaning. But that's not necessarily the case. We just mean that there's more than one meaning, and the humor is, of course, in the misunderstanding then, people taking it in the wrong way. And there's a lot of examples, there's a lot of jokes we could give. Let me just use a couple that I think make the point where, for example, a man's wife goes into labor, he's not sure what to do. He grabs his cell phone, he calls 911. The operator says, what's your emergency? And the man says, well, my wife's going into labor, what should I do? And so the operator says, well, is this her first child? And the caller says, no, this is her husband. Okay, so that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Oh, you'll just have to forgive me for that. But I thought it was worth having just a little example of it. And then, in fact, you may have heard me use that one before. But another one I've heard, just an old corny joke, again, where a man runs over a cat in front of a person's house, and he feels quite badly about it, and he realizes that it belongs to the owner of this home, so he approaches the front door, knocks on the door, and when the person answers, he says, I'm terribly sorry, but I believe it's your cat that I ran over and killed, and I feel really badly about it, and I would like to replace the cat. And the owner of the cat says, well, okay, but how good are you at catching mice? Okay, we need the little rim shot there to go off. But in all honesty, we do see this sort of thing in a few places in John's Gospel. And here we have a list of some of the major instances of Johannine irony. And right here at the start, we're not going to look at all of these. I've just highlighted a few that are worth noting here for a minute. But right at the start, we said the prologue, right there, the first 18 verses of John, we find there set out all the major themes, essentially all the major themes that we're going to encounter in the whole book. And we find there as well virtually all of the literary devices we find later in the book, including irony, and not just an instance of irony, but what is surely the most poignant and profoundly tragic irony in the history of the world, that he was in the world and the world was made through him, and yet the world did not know him. This is the NIV, did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, that is his own creation, and his own people, I think is the idea, did not receive him. So there we're hit right from the start with a powerful irony, and then it just, from there's just one after another layered throughout the gospel. When Philip, later in chapter 1, when Philip tells Nathanael, I found the Messiah, it's Jesus of Nazareth, and he hears Nazareth and he says, Nazareth? Can any good thing come out of Nazareth? And so he's skeptical that anything good can come from this obscure little town, and yet the irony is that not only can something good come out of Nazareth, but the very best thing is coming out of Nazareth. I'm going to pass over that one. I'll let you think about that one at the wine, when the water was turned into wine, at the wedding feast in Cana of Galilee. And maybe one of the humorous ones here is in chapter 3, in Jesus' conversation with Nicodemus, and Jesus talks about being born again or born anew, and he's asking, well, can you enter into your mother's womb a second time? And that's how puzzled he is. He doesn't get it. And then Jesus says to him, you're a teacher and you don't understand? Shouldn't you understand these things? So what an irony when the teacher is the one who is ignorant. And the idea of the Son of Man being lifted up is another profound irony in the book, because he's lifted up on the cross to die this ignominious death. He's lifted up cruelly and painfully, but we know it's a lifting up as well. It's symbolic of his being lifted up in the sense of being glorified, being exalted. And so there's obviously a lot of overlapping here, because we're finding in the symbolism, for example, in the use of metaphor and in some of the double meanings, we're finding the irony as well. So I love this one in his conversation with the woman at the well in chapter 4 and verse 12. And she's asked him, are you greater than our father Jacob? And he's only the Lord of all creation. And she doesn't know that, of course. And how ironic to wonder if he's better or greater than Jacob. And then in his conversation with her about her husband, there's quite a bit of irony going on there in that exchange. So Jesus himself is using it. And then she says, sir, I perceive that you're a prophet. Well, of course, he's not only a prophet, he's God. So we're seeing just one case after another. How interesting is that that whole exchange that Jesus has when he gives his discourse on the bread of life, that he is the bread of life and that you have to eat his flesh and drink his blood. And they're completely confused on that. Look at chapter 7, verse 15, when people are wondering, how did this man get such learning without having been taught? And of course, we know he's the source of all knowledge. We know that he is the fount of all wisdom and knowledge, and they wonder how he can have this when he hasn't gone to school. They wonder who's trying to kill him. When of course, the Jewish leaders were trying to kill him, and it's ironic that they think he's nuts and paranoid in believing that people are out to kill him. It's interesting, for example, in chapter 7, when John is trying to tell us about all of these different opinions and the confusion and misunderstandings among the people about Jesus, and one of the things in chapter 7 and verse 27, he notes is people were saying, well, we know where this man is from, but when the Messiah comes, no one will know where he's from. Well, that was a belief apparently that some had, that the Messiah would appear mysteriously with no hint of his origins, but the idea that they knew, we know where this man is from, when actually they didn't. So you can see just example after example after example. Here's an irony when the Jewish leaders say, or rather some of the people say, well, how can the Messiah come from Galilee? Doesn't the scripture say the Messiah will come from Bethlehem? Oh, it's interesting that they're excluding Jesus from being able to be the Messiah because the Messiah comes from Bethlehem. They don't realize Jesus is from Bethlehem. He was raised in Galilee, but he was born in Bethlehem. So you see this over and over. Look at in chapter 8, verse 53, a similar comment to what we have with the woman at the well. Are you greater? The Jewish leaders are absolutely incredulous at what Jesus is saying. Are you greater than our father Abraham? Like, it's inconceivable. Inconceivable, to quote the cinematic masterpiece, Princess Bride. Are you greater than our father Abraham? Who do you think you are? Well, I can just leave that alone because the irony is so obvious, isn't it, there? But continuing here, they think Jesus is not 50 years old. How in the world could he know Abraham? And of course, Jesus created Abraham. And that's when Jesus speaks of himself in timeless terms and identifies himself as the I am. So example after example, let me just slide these by here, and I don't want to take too much more time looking at these, but I will have them in the file and you can look at them. Notice they believe he's guilty of blasphemy. I like, though, that Jesus uses, this is what I meant by the fact that there's humor, and in fact the humor is often, we find it being used by Jesus himself and in a biting or a stinging way, because notice here when they're about to stone him, and Jesus says, okay, I've shown you many good works. And in John's gospel, the good works, that refers to the miracles that he did. So I've shown you many good works from the Father. So for which of these do you stone me? So why don't you tell us which miracle did I do that you're stoning me for causing the lame man to be able to walk? Is it because of this good thing that I did? Or it's just something we find over and over in John's gospel. And then, of course, they think he's guilty of blasphemy because you, a mere man, claim to be God. And yet it's John's gospel where we're finding that the proof, I think the most explicit proofs that he is God. Let's look at chapter 11. This is the one that I think is the greatest example of people saying something, ironically, saying more than they know, and perhaps even the opposite of what they intend. You remember how the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, is meeting after Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead and trying to decide what to do about Jesus because of his immense popularity among the people. And of course, the Jewish leaders are rejecting Jesus. And so Notice verse 47. So this is John 11:47. So the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and said, "What are we to do? For this man performed many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation." Then look at this. Look at this. But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all." Look at the arrogance. "You know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it is better." Notice he says, it's better for you that one man should die for the people. Wow. That one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish. And of course, we realize he means that we need to kill this Jesus so that the Romans won't come when all these people begin following Jesus, and they'll believe that this movement is a threat to their power, and so they'll come and destroy our nation. And so he's thinking this one man, Jesus, needs to die so our nation won't perish, so that we won't be destroyed by the Romans. And of course, he doesn't realize that that's exactly what Jesus is going to do. He's going to die so that the people won't perish. John 3:16, that whoever believes in him should not, there's that same term, right? Should not perish. So it's interesting, they think, we've got to kill him or the Romans will come and destroy us. And yet another irony here is that in killing Jesus, in rejecting their Messiah, God then brings the Romans against them to destroy the city of Jerusalem. He removes his hand of protection, and it's because of their rejection of their Messiah that God allows the Romans then to come and they utterly destroy the city of Jerusalem. And so notice John then even tells you, verse 51, he did not say this of his own accord. This is one of the most intriguing things to me said in the whole gospel, because he says, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but also to gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. So he didn't even realize that he was uttering a prophecy about Jesus, and how he meant his words in one way, and yet God was using what he said. God was using him to say that to mean something else. It's just incredible to think that he doesn't even realize it. And so that's what we meant by there are times when the characters not only say more than they intend, but perhaps even the opposite of what they intend. So let me move this and go back to our list. Okay, so, and then, as I said, you can continue through the gospel and you find it over and over again, just case after case. But then look at these here. Late in the gospel, during the passion of Jesus, when he is on trial and he's before Pilate. Wow, what an irony when Jesus said that he came to bear witness to the truth, and Pilate scoffs. I think he's saying this with a kind of cynicism, where he's just saying, well, what is truth? And yet there, standing right before him, is truth itself, is Jesus, who is the way, the truth, and the life. There's Jesus standing right before him, truth personified. And then after he has Jesus scourged, and he says, likely in Latin, ecce homo, behold the man. Here is the man. And so he's saying, look at him. Look at what a pitiful specimen here that I'm setting before you. He really was hoping that that would be sufficient, that he would have Jesus scourged, and yet what he says is really what John's gospel does, is it puts Jesus before us and says, look at him, behold, behold. And then he says, here is your king. And of course he means it in a cynical way. He's being sarcastic. And that's what I meant to say earlier. Jesus was using sarcasm when he said, which good work are you going to stone me for? And here we find sarcasm again on the lips of a key character in John's gospel. And the irony, of course, is that we know he truly is king, and not just king, but as we will find in another Johannine book, the book of Revelation, he is King of Kings. All right, we spent a lot of time on that, but it is something we need to take note of, and we'll think about when we close. As I said, we'll think about the impact that is intended to have upon us. But we're going to put right here, as you see, the metaphor and irony under the symbolism and double meanings in John's gospel. But let's now look at a related issue, when you think of the double meanings and such, that leads us to the motif of misunderstanding that we have in John's gospel. And often, as we said, that's where the irony is, that's where the humor is, that's where we find the sarcasm and such, where we find again and again throughout his gospel there is misunderstanding. And I'm going to call it, with the disciples, maybe momentary misunderstanding, in the sense that it's presented in John's gospel. Their misunderstandings are presented in a way where we're assured that when the right time comes, they're going to understand it. So it's sort of I'm calling it a delayed understanding, that they're going to come to have the correct understanding, but just not yet when we encounter the misunderstanding in the gospel. Now, we do find a motif of misunderstanding in the synoptics to some extent, especially in Mark, where Mark has a very negative presentation of the disciples' misunderstanding. It's a persistent misunderstanding. But in John's gospel, we find it so frequent. It's just woven throughout the narrative. It's just a dominant part of the way John tells his story. And we find it not just with the Jewish leaders and with the disciples, but with a wide array of characters and among various people that John brings into the story. And as we already noted, it's often woven together with irony, so that these misunderstandings become really profound in the ironies and in the truths that are going to be disclosed to us through the way these misunderstandings are addressed. So that's the fact that we do find them in the synoptics is something we want to acknowledge, but we find once more, though, a unique emphasis with the misunderstanding in John's gospel. And typically they follow this pattern where there will be a pronouncement, usually by Jesus, and often where Jesus will speak of himself using some metaphor, and there's some ambiguity. There's double entendre there, and so that leads to some kind of response where the people ask a question or protest, like with Nicodemus. Jesus says that you have to be born again. Well, okay, there is some ambiguity there, and there's a play on words, and so the response indicates a failure to understand. Or John will just tell us in the narrative that they didn't understand. He'll do that again and again, as we'll see. And then that leads to the opportunity for an explanation of of what Jesus really means, either by Jesus himself or by John clarifying the meaning. So we see how these misunderstandings become an important part of the way the truth is presented to us by John. And in fact, I want to emphasize that by saying that the misunderstanding and then the explanation of the misunderstandings, that whole motif is an important literary device in John for developing these themes that are such a crucial part of what he is telling us, that are at the foundation of what he's revealing to us. And so the misunderstanding motif, what it does is it spotlights and illuminates truths, important, critical truths about Jesus' identity, about his nature, where he came from, where he is going. He talks a lot about how he came down, that he has come from above, he has come from heaven, and he's going back. So often we find the misunderstandings become a way for John to reveal to us Jesus' identity, his nature, his origin, his destiny, his work, all of that. And so we get to a list of some of them. And once more, I'll include these in the file that you can access from the link below in the description box. And I'll try to have all these references for you. But some of them, these misunderstandings, a couple of them that are a little bit humorous to me. But one of them is in chapter 4 here, you see on this list. Notice, of course, right there at the beginning, in chapter 2, when Jesus says, well, I'm going to, they ask for a sign, and Jesus says, destroy this temple, and I will build it again in 3 days. So you see how Jesus realizes they're going to think of the actual material temple there in Jerusalem, and he's talking about the temple of his body. And so it becomes a cryptic sort of way for Jesus to talk about himself and for John to talk about Jesus. So in chapter 4, though, I like this when you find the disciples don't understand Jesus' reference to food, because notice the text says the disciples were urging him, saying, Rabbi, eat. But he said to them, well, I have food to eat that you do not know about. Well, he had just been teaching the Samaritan woman about himself, and this was what the Lord sent him. This is what his Father sent him to do. And so this was a fulfilling thing for Jesus. And so he's speaking of that. Here you have the metaphor, and then here you have the misunderstanding. So the disciples said to one another, has anyone brought him something to eat? He said, I've got food you don't know about. And they're all thinking, oh, well, did one of you bring him food? And Jesus then explains, well, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work. So I like that one because to me, once again, it seems humorous. But of course, they misunderstand Jesus when he says he is the bread that has come down from heaven, and that he is going to give them his flesh to eat, and they need to eat his flesh and drink his blood. This is a very provocative way. This is a very graphic way for Jesus to speak about himself. And he knows there's going to be this misunderstanding, and that it's going to cause this reaction, and that allows him to elaborate even further. And it prompts, as we pointed out earlier, these metaphors prompt thought, and they bring to mind multiple dimensions of meaning, and so they're very important on numerous levels here. But you find misunderstandings of all different sorts in the gospel. In here, you see how in this reference here, in chapter 6 and throughout chapter 7, chapter 8, the people don't understand when Jesus is talking about where he is from, his otherworldly destiny. This list is from Kirstenberger. And they're confused about his origin, and they don't understand that he really is from Bethlehem. Notice when Jesus said, those who keep my word, they'll never taste of death. And then when Jesus talks about how Abraham rejoiced to see my day, Abraham saw my day. Well, they don't understand what he's talking about there, and that's when they say, well, you're not 50 years old and you've seen Abraham? How in the world did Abraham ever see you? And they don't realize Jesus means that Abraham was looking down the stream of time by faith. See? And so all kinds of misunderstandings. I like this one. To me, I don't know why this one has always struck me as humorous, where in chapter 11, they think when Jesus says Lazarus has fallen asleep, they think that they think he just means, well, he's just literally sleeping. Let me pull that up, in fact, because that one's, I think, worth looking at. So notice verse 11, chapter 11, verse 11, that after saying, right here, after saying these things, he said to him, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him. So the disciples said to him, well, Lord, if he's fallen asleep, he'll recover. They think he just means he was sick, and so he's having to sleep through an illness. But look at verse 13. See, it leads to an explanation. In this case, John tells us about the misunderstanding. Now, Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought he meant taking rest and sleep. So then Jesus told him plainly, this is why it seemed a little, I know it's a very serious matter talking about the death of his beloved friend here, Lazarus, but then Jesus told him plainly, okay, Lazarus is dead. It says in the ASV, and I think the ESV, Lazarus has died. That's what I meant. So you see the motif of misunderstanding over and over and over again. I'm not going to, as I said, go through all the examples. I just want you to realize and see how extensive it is. The crowd doesn't understand. Chapter 12, how he must be lifted up. Again, we see an overlap here with irony and metaphor. Peter doesn't understand the significance of Jesus washing his feet. And at first he says, no, Lord, you'll never wash my feet. And then he says, well, when he thinks he understands what Jesus is doing, then he says, oh, yes, well, my feet and my head also. And then there Jesus speaks metaphorically when he talks about being clean. You remember we pointed that out. And so again and again, they misunderstand Jesus when he talks about having to go away, when he talks about himself being the way, right? And that leads to him then, again, we said these then become an opportunity in the explanation, an opportunity to highlight Jesus' identity. He says, well, I am the way. I am the way to the Father. And so the disciples fail to understand even at first when John and Peter run to the empty tomb. They fail to understand. So it happens over and over. Mary Magdalene, it's interesting, she doesn't recognize when she's talking to Jesus. She doesn't realize that it's Jesus risen from the dead, mistakes him for the gardener. And so as we said, you find it just throughout the gospel from beginning to end. It's a dominant feature of the way John tells us his story. Now let me go back to that idea of this momentary misunderstanding, because John, unlike Mark, where the disciples just persistently don't get it, and Mark just tells you they didn't understand, John, though, wants to assure you that they didn't understand at that time. But that they would then understand in due time once events unfolded. And there are several key references where you find that assurance being given. And you don't find that in Matthew and Mark. Luke, you find, I believe, one reference, but not like you do in John. What John does is he makes it clear that you do have misunderstanding, but there is going to be this epiphany later where they're going to see it. So when they misunderstand, he wants to point you, though, to the end of the story, and keep in mind that a couple of things are going to happen. There are two things, at least, that are critical that lead to the unfolding of the truth, where then they're able to grasp, then they're able to come to understanding. And the first thing that is important, that stands in the way of the fuller understanding, is, of course, the resurrection. The resurrection, it will be, John says, after Jesus is raised, that, then they got it. See, John wants to tell you that. And the giving of the Spirit and receiving the Spirit, those two things then are what take us to the full understanding. So notice in John 2, for example, when Jesus said, verse 19, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And the Jews misunderstand him, and they don't realize he's talking about his body. Verse 21, he was talking about the temple of his body. In verse 22, then, when therefore he was raised from the dead. So John wants to make sure to insert this so that we realize that it's when the resurrection comes, they're going to get it. They're going to get it. So he wants you to be thinking of that as you read the story. And then in chapter 12, notice this, when you have the triumphant entry into Jerusalem and everyone is heralding Jesus as the Messiah. And notice chapter 12, verse 16, his disciples did not understand these things at first. See, that's what John wants to keep telling you. They didn't get it at first, but when Jesus was glorified, yes, see, then they remembered that these things had been written about him and had been done to him. So he wants us to understand the key to their final understanding, or them coming to an understanding. And then ultimately it will be when the Spirit comes. In the farewell discourse, Jesus says this several times. When we look at the theology of his gospel and we look at what's said about the Holy Spirit, we'll return to this, but Jesus tells them, when the Spirit of truth comes, verse 13. See, there's a lot, verse 12. There are many things I want to say unto you. See, they don't have understanding now. Whoops, wrong tool. They don't have understanding now, you see. But you will have understanding later. When the Spirit of truth comes, he's going to guide you into all the truth. So they're going to get it later, after the resurrection, and then even more fully, finally, when the Spirit comes and guides them into all the truth. So remember, what leads then from misunderstanding to understanding is the resurrection and the revelation they receive by the Spirit. John is wanting to make sure we understand that the whole story of Jesus cannot be understood unless we understand it in light of the resurrection, and that it is the revelation that comes by the Holy Spirit that gives us full understanding. So you see how the misunderstanding motif and the delayed understanding on the part of the disciples becomes a way for John to emphasize those two things. All right, as we think about all these literary features then, and so we were looking at in the symbolism of John's gospel, how frequently we have these double meanings and metaphor, irony, misunderstanding, and these last ones here are related. Are related to. I keep apologizing for things that you're not actually seeing on the screen, but I'm goofing up a lot of times and scribbling with the wrong tool, and it doesn't show up on the recording if I undo it really quickly. So I'm apologizing for my apologizing. But these here, with the symbolism and the misunderstanding, where we find so often that John will pause in the narrative to explain things to us. And these are called Johannine asides, okay? We've already seen them over and over again, but he does it with a lot of other things too. So this is a literary feature that you cannot help but be struck with as you're reading through his gospel. You just see that unlike Matthew, Mark, and Luke, John keeps pausing to explain things to us as the reader, and will suggest what this means or why John is doing this here in a moment. But let me give examples once more of what I'm talking about, and then we'll wrap this up. Now, here's a long list in different categories of Johannine asides, and these are from, let me pull that down, these are from Kirstenberger in his excellent work. Now, Andreas Kirstenberger is really considered to be a leading authority on the Gospel of John and on John's letters, but I think his Gospel especially. He's studied extensively and written extensively on it, and so his material is very scholarly, but it's accessible. He has some commentaries on John that are written on more of a popular level, but this is taken from his work, A Theology of John's Gospel and Letters. And this is in an excellent series, by the way, that I highly recommend. The Biblical Theology of the New Testament series. So let me just pull up some here for you, and I have to move this text slowly or it's not really readable. It keeps, when I move it, it gets a little blurry. But here are some of the categories where we find John pausing to tell us things here about the story. For example, he'll give us translations of Aramaic or Hebrew terms. Okay, well, we do, as we've pointed out, we do find that at times in the synoptics. So I'm not going to go through all those. I just want you to see they're there. He'll explain the topography of Palestine in a few references there. See, these are important because they show us that the writer is someone who was very familiar with the language, the customs, and the territory. Notice he explains, you have an explanation of Jewish customs. He'll tell us these 6 stone water pots were there because he says it's the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing. So he's helping us understand what's going on by doing that. But notice here, though, we're going to get to this when we look at the theology or the Christology of John's Gospel, more specifically, that you'll find here these references to Jesus' supernatural insight or foreknowledge of events, that he knows what's going on. For instance, notice it says let me get the highlighter here. Notice it says, for Jesus had known from the beginning which of them did believe and who would betray him. And here he says, for he knew what was in them. That's why he didn't trust himself to some people. Notice down here in chapter 13, and this is a great one. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Jesus knew that the Father put all things under his power and that he had come and was returning to God. So John wants to keep telling you, Jesus knows. Jesus understands. Jesus is well aware. Look at this. Look at how unique this is to John's Gospel. Jesus, he'll say, unlike you find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he'll pause and say, knowing all that was going to happen to him. And then even later, knowing, even on the cross rather, knowing that everything now had been finished. Those are powerful and important Johannine asides. Here, look at this. References to characters or events that are mentioned earlier in the narrative. He keeps referring back to those that he'll pause and do that again and again. Not going to notice those references to the fulfillment of Scripture or how something that Jesus said is fulfilled. John will pause and tell you that. We'll look at that later when we see how he uses the Old Testament. But here, we were talking about this, and so I highlighted it here with a different color to notice that you'll have these Johannine asides where he's telling you when people didn't understand something that Jesus said or something that was happening. Somehow, somewhere along the way, someone doesn't know something. But ones that we haven't noted yet, right here, for even in chapter 7 and verse 5, for even his own brothers did not believe on him. Notice he tells us they did not understand that he was telling them about the Father. Jesus in chapter 10 verse 6 used this figure of speech, but the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them. In chapter 11, Jesus had been speaking of his death. Notice we just looked at that, but his disciples thought that he meant natural sleep. So over and over, he keeps telling us about people not getting it. You'll have John explain that to us again and again, and then you'll have these times where he then wants to clarify and give us the meaning. So we already looked at several of these examples, but he'll tell us the reason they were trying to kill him is because he was calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. So John will pause and explain to you what they were thinking and why they were doing it. This is unique. The extent to which he does this makes John's gospel unique, and it makes his story all the more intriguing. It brings you into the narrative. It makes the story all the more informative, all the more gripping, but also all the more inviting as you go through, because John is bringing you into the story and letting you in on what is happening. We're going to conclude with that here in just a moment. But John will keep pausing to explain things like his parents. Notice his parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders. They didn't want to be put out of the synagogue. So John wants to tell you that. He wants to explain to you Jesus loved Martha and her sister Lazarus, so that when they heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed there 2 more days. He wants to tell you, though, that he wants to give you more information about the story, and then gives you this very personal insight in the love that Jesus had for Martha and her sister and brother. And then we already pointed this one out with Caiaphas. And then I like this one with Judas. Judas didn't say this because he cared about the poor. John wants to make sure you understand the characters in the narrative. See, this is making John's story a lot different from the synoptics in the way that he says, you know what? Judas didn't care about the poor, but he did it because he was a thief. And as a keeper in the money bag, he used to steal from it. So John, as we said, these Johannine asides, we're going to encounter them over and over and over again as you go through the narrative. And it's important to take note of them and to understand, as we're going to see here in a moment, we want to understand, what is this doing? By these kinds of statements, what is happening here with the way that the Holy Spirit is having John tell this story, and the impact that it's going to make on us as readers? He will at times he will speak in a way that he expects some familiarity with the other Gospels, with what we find in the other Gospels, or the source material that were used by the other gospel writers. Sometimes he'll number events. He'll pause to tell you give you how many times something has happened, and you'll get extended commentary. And I think John 3:16, the golden text and a key text of the book, I think that's John. It's not Jesus. Jesus stops talking with Nicodemus, and it's John. It's a Johannine aside. It's a Johannine commentary that comes later in another important statement of the book. So, and then you'll find it often. He'll give other, there's a few examples tacked on at the end of other clarifying or explanatory statements. So, in all different ways, you find that John pauses and speaks to you and to me as the reader to explain more to us. And we're at 55 minutes. We're just about done. But look, here I think is the important design of this. So what you find then in John constantly telling us about people's misunderstandings, but then clarifying and explaining things to us, is you have here often the misunderstanding, as we pointed out, is because of some metaphor. There's the symbolism. There's what's being said and what's being perceived on the surface. But there is the deeper truth represented by that. There's the deeper meaning beneath the surface. Now, the people over here, they're misunderstanding what's going on. But John is providing you with the understanding. So over here, you have those who don't know, those who are blind, those who are in darkness. But then John is explaining things to us, and he wants us to know, and knowing, those are key terms in John's gospel. So over here, you have those who know, who can see, because the light of Christ, the light of truth, is being explained and explicated by John. So what you find in John's gospel is you have the outsiders who don't get it, who continue to misunderstand because they're refusing to accept the truth about Jesus. So they've closed their eyes and they're blind and they're walking in darkness and they're only seeing the surface and they're not coming to understanding. But you see, then you have the insiders, and they're the ones who are getting it. And John, I think what we're seeing here is that in the way John tells the story with the motif of misunderstanding, and by giving us all of these explanatory asides, is he's wanting us to be one of those insiders and letting us know that here, I'm explaining it to you so that you can see it. Here is the truth, so that you can know it, so that you then are one of the insiders. You get it. See, you as the reader can know and can understand what so many others in the gospel story, what so many other characters don't get. John wants you to get it. And let me finish then, since we're leaving the literary devices of John's gospel, and they're so important when we see how uniquely John tells his story. And there's a couple of great quotes that Kirstenberger notes from Culpepper's work. I have this work by Culpepper, and he has several quite scholarly treatments of John's gospel. And so maybe his work is not as accessible to just the average reader. But look at what he said, and I think this is a great way to finish up talking about the symbolism and all that we've been looking at here. He says, the misunderstandings are a dramatic portrayal of the plight of those whose understanding is limited to the mundane. So he's talking about the misunderstandings. The ironies of the story, like the misunderstandings, but more subtly, they invite the reader to share the implied author's higher vantage point. Now I'm saying that author is John. But from it, the blindness of the characters around Jesus and the half-hidden truth which fill their conversations may be clearly seen. Wow, isn't that tremendous? And the symbols employed by the implied author and his central character, our Lord Jesus, of course, open even richer and more stimulating views into the order and mystery of the world above. Wow, this is a tremendous, tremendous quote. I absolutely love this and want you to think about that. And just one more here. Look at this. So he says the symbols of John's gospel. I love this. They're often the ladder on which readers, like the angels of Jacob's dream, may ascend and descend while moving to and from the heaven open by the story. So the symbols, like the images, the metaphors, and the motifs, and the themes to which they are related, all that stuff we were looking at, and the themes that we're going to be looking at coming up here, often carry the principal burden of the narrative and provide implicit commentary and directional signals for the reader. Oh, I love the way he says that those symbols, they're often the ladder. They're like the ladder of Jacob's dream. They allow us to ascend to a higher understanding. They open up the story. Oh, isn't that a great way? Because that's a great way to express that, because that's exactly what's happening, where they become like a window to higher spiritual truth, to the way Kirstenberger puts it in one place. He says opening a window to a world of mystery and transcendent reality, and providing a place where the finite and the infinite can meet. Wow, I need to tack that on. I'm going to tack that on at the end, at the very last slide, for you as well. But that's where we'll finish for now. I hope you can see the power of the symbolism that we encounter in such a dramatic way in the fourth gospel. So as always, peace to you. I look forward to being with you again. And until then, may the Lord bless you and keep you.